Ladies and gentlemen, now we move on to the panel discussion, the pinnacle moment on the agenda, under the title International Monetary Fund Bailout and Economic Future of Sri Lanka. We are privileged to have three eminent panelists today. Professor Shanta Devarajan, Professor of Practice of Development, Georgetown University, USA. Dr. Nishan Dimel, Executive Director, Verite Research Private Limited. And joining us online, Mr. Suresh Shah, Head of State-Owned Enterprise Restructuring Unit. Today's panel discussion will be moderated by Dr. Tamara Jayasundara. I cordially invite the panelists and the moderator for the panel discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, as the panelists arrange themselves on stage, let me brief you about their profiles. Firstly, Professor Shanta Devarajan. Professor Shanta is a Professor of Practice of International Development at the Georgetown University's Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service. He was previously at the World Bank, where he was the Senior Director for Development Economics, the Chief Economist for the Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, and Human Development Networks in the same regions. He was also a director of 2004 World Development Report titled Making Services Work for Poor People. Before 1991, Professor Shanta was on the faculty of the Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Born in Sri Lanka, he received a PhD in economics from the University of California and mathematics from Princeton University. With that enterprising scholar, now we move on to our second panelist, Dr. Nishan Dimel, the founder of Verite Research and Executive Director of the same. Nishan Dimel is the Executive Director of Verite Research Private Limited, a think tank providing analytical research and advisory services on economics, politics, and legal issues in Sri Lanka. He is an economist with an extensive academic, policy, and private sector experience. In Sri Lanka, Dr. Nishan Dimel has been a member of the Presidential Task Force on Health Sector Reform, Presidential Committee on Tobacco, Alcohol, and Dangerous Drug Regulation, and the National Steering Committee on Social Security. Internationally, Dr. Nishan has held several governing, teaching, and research positions, including as lecturer in economics at Oxford University. With that nurturing leader, now we move on to our third panelist joining online, Mr. Suresh Shah. Briefing about Mr. Shah, he is a fellow member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Sri Lanka. He is a past chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and the Employers Federation of Ceylon. Previously, he served as a Commissioner of Security and Exchange Commission of Sri Lanka, a member of the Council of the University of Muratua, and a member of the Monetary Policy Consultative Committee and Central Bank of Sri Lanka. It is encouraging to note he served as a CEO and board member of many public listed companies for 30 years prior to retirement. He currently sits as an independent, non-executive director on a number of listed and private sector entities, while serving as a chairman in 2 of them. He also heads the State-Owned Enterprise Reform Unit of the Government of Sri Lanka. While that being said, we believe that the profiles speak for themselves, ladies and gentlemen. So I hand over the floor to our moderator, Dr. Tamara Jayasundara.
Right, okay, thank you. Thank you, Dinesha, for that introduction to our esteemed panelists. And I am very happy and humbled to have such a distinguished panel with us today. And of course, I wish we were speaking about something much more upbeat, about something like expanding our advanced manufacturing or something like that. Unfortunately, our little nation is facing a severe economic downturn, and that is why we are gathered here today to speak about the IMF bailout and the economic future of Sri Lanka. It has been a long, difficult time period for all of us. We have endured long fuel lines, increasing prices. Prices have doubled, in some cases tripled, and those wage-earning middle-class families have been moved to low-income categories. Low-income families are now below poverty, and those who are in poverty, we cannot even imagine. So people are frustrated, tired. It has probably started with maybe, if we can think of even the Easter Sunday attack. So starting from that, it has been 4 long years. People want answers, and I can't think of a better group of people to ask these questions and get answers for those questions than the panelists that is with us today. So without any further ado, let's get started. And just a few announcements for those who are joining online. Please stay muted. And also, if you have questions, send it on the chat, and we will get to that at the end of the panel discussion, which will last for an hour. So with that, let's start. And as the topic says, IMF bailout and the economic future of Sri Lanka, I will first like to ask the question, why? Why do we need the IMF bailout? And also, is that the best solution for us? Are there any other alternatives? Any serious alternatives that we could have thought about or we can rely on? So basically, I will open it to all the panelists, but we will go through about 5 or 6 questions, 10 minutes each per question. So I will raise this question starting from Professor Shantadev.
Very much. First of all, let me say it's a real pleasure to be here. This is my first time at Kutala Defense University. And when Tamara called me, I immediately accepted her invitation because this is a unique opportunity to engage, especially with students and civil society and officials here in Sri Lanka. Now, let me take your question, Tamara, specifically. And I want to start with the word bailout, because I want a campaign to try to drop this word from our vocabulary, because I think it's an inappropriate metaphor. You know, bailout, the original word bailout comes from when a ship is sinking and filling up with water, and you take a bucket and try to empty it, empty the water, because the origin of the word is from the word for bucket in Latin. That's not the situation in Sri Lanka. But the other reason I want to drop this word is that it combines 2 different concepts. And I want to make it clear, that's what the situation in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has 2 problems. One of which was that it had a low level of foreign exchange reserves. The reserves dropped back in 2002. 2020, up to a very low level, and Sri Lanka was cut off from borrowing in capital markets. So that's the first time that when you reach that situation, the usual approach is to seek an IMF program, which would then, because the IMF is the lender of last resort. So the IMF would then provide a loan to Sri Lanka and also work with the Sri Lankans to undertake certain policy changes so that you don't have a problem again 18 months later. Just for the record, Sri Lanka did not do that and delayed going to an IMF program for 2 years. But the second problem that Sri Lanka had, and still has, is that its debt is unsustainable. It's a very different problem, because the first one is, if you like, a liquidity problem. Your reserves are down. The other is that you're not in a position to generate enough revenues to pay back the debt that you owe. And for that, Sri Lanka needed, and still needs, to achieve a restructuring of the debt. You work with the creditors to try to reduce the amount of debt that you're owed, so that then you can pay back the debt. It's what we call to make the debt sustainable. Now I want to come to the IMF in this case, because the IMF then plays two roles. The first is this program where I said the IMF will provide a loan, and the conditions are that Sri Lanka undertakes certain policy reforms so that you don't have another crisis 2 years, 3 years later. But that's the IMF program, what we call the Extended Fund Facility, the EFF. The role of the IMF in debt restructuring is very different, because the debt restructuring is something that the Sri Lankans have to do with their creditors. You have to negotiate with the creditors. But it's very inefficient, and it's not in Sri Lanka's interest to negotiate individually with each creditor, because you don't have very much bargaining power then. And so you could negotiate with the Chinese and the Indians and the Japanese and the bondholders individually. That won't work. So usually, almost always, when a country goes into a debt restructuring, what they do is call for a collective debt restructuring. You want all the creditors to get together and negotiate with Sri Lanka so that we can achieve a certain level of lower level of debt. But then the question comes, what should be that level of debt? What is the sustainable level of debt? And this is where the IMF comes in, because the IMF is, if you like, a credible, neutral party. They're not one of the creditors, nor are they the debtor. So they do the analysis to say, we think this is the level of debt that is sustainable. And then that allows the creditors to come together and say, okay, if this is the level of debt we're trying to achieve, then I will take this much of a cut and you will take that much of a cut. So it provides a common framework around which you can embark on the debt restructure. So those are the two parts to what has been used to be called the bailout, but it's the program that we're embarked on. One is the EFF, which is to try to get some money, and I think it's fair to say we're very close to achieving the EFF program, and mainly because Sri Lanka has done all the conditions, they've met all the prior actions. And the second part of it is the debt restructuring, and again, I think we're close to being in a position where we can start those negotiations. We're not there yet, but we can start them.
Maybe if you can add, are there any other alternatives to this IMF program?
Thank you, Tamara. I can be heard, right? Just to say thanks so much for inviting me here. It's my first time in Kottayam Defence University. One of our research directors has been teaching a course here, and we've had great graduates from Kottayam Defence University joining Verite. One of them is here today as well, and working with us, so we really appreciate what the Defence University does in terms of teaching and bringing people with intelligence and ability into the academic intellectual circles of the country. I'm going to just kind of say what Shanta said in a sort of a different form, okay? Because Shanta is sort of saying it from the global perspective, I'm going to kind of say it more from a country perspective. Sri Lanka was effectively enacting what you call a Ponzi scheme. For those who are not familiar with that word, Charles Ponzi was a financial entrepreneur in Boston in the 1920s who told people, give me your money, I have this great investment plan in London, and I'll give you a very high interest rate. And of course, when people gave him the money, he gave them a high interest rate, and they started saying, this is a fantastic thing, he's much better than a bank, we should give him more money. And everybody started giving him more and more money. for his investment scheme. What they didn't know was Charles Ponzi didn't have a fantastic investment proposition in London. He took the new money and paid off the old money at a high interest. Now you can see that this is not sustainable. You keep having to increase, taking more and more money to pay off the people you borrowed from first, and at some point you're not going to be able to grow the amount of money you're going to get to match the outflow. That's now today in the world called a Ponzi scheme. And if you look at what Sri Lanka was doing in the run-up to 2020, we were in a Ponzi scheme from 2010 to 15. We increased our total debt about 8%, and of course spent it on all sorts of things. And 40% of that was to repay interest on previous debt. From 15 to 19, we still increased total debt by 40%, and these are published paper by Verite. You can go to our website and look at how to do the analysis. And 89% of that, 89.8, so almost 90% of that increase was to pay the interest on the previous debt. This was a Ponzi scheme. It was never going to be sustainable. Now imagine Charles Ponzi, as he got found out and had to pay everybody and didn't have the money because he's paid the previous guys, suddenly decides to sell his house, his properties, and take his children's school books, take off, stop feeding his kids, and keep paying his creditors. His family would be very upset. One thing to be a fraud, another thing to now starve your family to pay the creditors. Charles Ponzi should have come out clean and told his creditors, I made a mistake, let's figure out how to pay you back something. But Sri Lanka did the opposite. We ended up paying our creditors at the expense of our society and our people, while there was not getting food, not getting medicine, not getting cooking gas, staying in lines for 30 hours sometimes. Sri Lanka continued to favor the external creditor over its own population. Shanta and I, sort of wrote articles, showed out what Lebanon was happening in Lebanon, and tried to make it stop, but we couldn't. And of course, then we ran out of money anyway. Okay. So why do you need the IMF? And I'll give you 3 reasons why you need the IMF. Clearly, our policymakers and our bureaucrats didn't have the technical ability to understand what was going on. And when you're in a situation like this, at minimum, you need what you call a debt sustainability analysis. You need to do the numbers. Sri Lanka so far hasn't produced a debt sustainability analysis of its own that I have seen. So we need the IMF just for technical capability, it seems, to go and say, hey, can you do our debt sustainability analysis for us, or can you help us do it? Because if we were so capable, we wouldn't have got into the problem to begin with. Okay. So technical support. The second reason why we need the IMF is, you need somebody to help you negotiate with your creditors. The creditors are other countries, the creditors are private bondholders, the creditors are multilateral agencies like the World Bank and ADB, and there is no world bankruptcy court that you can go to. What you have is the IMF. That's the structural equivalent of a global bankruptcy court that says, look, I will tell the creditors, this is all you can do. And I'll tell them, tough luck, you've got to lose some money, you lent it, and you lent money that wasn't sustainably being invested, so you've got to take a haircut, but the borrower who has misbehaved can't go and tell people, look, I'm not going to pay you, that's not good enough. You need a third party that has the confidence and the structural sort of ability to be that broker of that negotiation. So you need the IMF. And when we talk about letters of assurance these days, India, China, the Paris Club, what are those letters of assurance? It's that the IMF has basically said, look, this is what we think Sri Lanka can do. And these countries and agencies are saying, okay, we trust the broker. The broker is giving the right advice, and we'll help Sri Lanka to come out of it. Now, without that broker, that would have been very difficult to get that assurance and path forward. third thing that the IMF can do is, and why it can be a broker, is it can tell the world and your creditors that we have faith in Sri Lanka's actions. We think Sri Lanka will now behave better, will not, will pay back what it can, won't pay back the other bit. So there's credibility problem. Because let's say you are borrowing and well, nobody's going to believe Charles Ponce, right? Don't know what he'll do with their money.
So
so if you're misusing the money, then you need somebody else to anchor the credibility. So those three things. You need the IMF for technical support, for negotiations, for credibility, and the credibility is critical. Okay? Like, what's the alternative, Tamara? So I'm going to tell you that. The alternative would be if you could do the technical analysis yourself. If you can find another broker that's better than the IMF, who has more confidence in the world, and if you could give yourself credibility somehow, do something to give yourself credibility in the eyes of the world without needing the IMF to say that plan is good. So if you had such a mechanism, if you had another broker that said, look, or the technical capability, if you had the ability to have another negotiator that was better, and if you could actually build credibility all on your own, then that's an alternative.
So what you're saying is there's no other alternative.
I mean, there may be some countries that get into difficulty and people trust their governments, their bureaucracy so much that the IMF's role is small in comparison. But I think Sri Lanka doesn't have that history and that credibility. We've been in 16 IMF programs, completed only 7. We have failed to meet the revenue targets that we announced in our budget for the last 20 years.
So, Dr. Nishan, I'm going to come to you. Now I'm going to move on to the next question. And I think I was going to ask what are the other prior conditions that we need to meet, but I think you said we met all those prior conditions. So I'm going to go on with the next. If there aren't any other prior conditions, in order to ensure that we will get the full IMF program, what conditions or what measures do we need to fulfill throughout the program? Maybe shortly you, and maybe I would actually yes, Mr. Suresha, if you can explain on that, what conditions do we need to fulfill?
Thank you, Tamara. It's a great pleasure to be here with the KDU. Unfortunately, I'm not there physically. This was the alternative in that sense, coming online. Honestly, Tamara, I think that particular question I would prefer if either Shanta or Nishan were to take, because I'm sure they are much more knowledgeable on that particular subject than I am. As to what conditions that we need to fulfill. So I don't know, maybe Shanta or Nishan?
Okay, I'll take I'll take the first shot. So first let's go back to what are the conditions that have already been fulfilled. And these are, and I don't like to use the term condition again, because these are just important actions for Sri Lanka to take, whether or not the IMF existed. See, that's the other thing. I mean, if you talk about an alternative to the IMF, whoever is there, Sri Lanka was in a situation where you had very low taxes. The tax to GDP ratio was 8% of GDP. You had a fiscal deficit of 13% of GDP. You had inflation at 50%. And you had a current account deficit as well. When you're in that situation, there's a set of policies that you have to undertake. No matter who you are, and no matter what your political leanings are, left-wing governments, right-wing governments, they all have to face the same constraints. So they have to raise taxes, cut expenditures, and in Sri Lanka's case, it was to cut subsidy, which is to raise the price of electricity, as we observed recently. The third is to increase cash transfers that are targeted to the poor, not targeted to the rich, but targeted to the poor, to protect them from the austerity. The fourth is to raise interest rates, because interest rates were artificially low during the build-up to the crisis, and that's one of the reasons we had the crisis. fifth, I lost count. Fifth would be to depreciate the exchange rate, because the exchange rate was hugely overvalued. It was 200 rupees to the dollar, and it then had to go up to about 350 or 360. And the sixth is what Suresh is doing, which is to restructure the public enterprises, such as Sri Lankan Airlines or CEB or Ceylon Petroleum Corporations. Those are good things to do, whether the IMF existed or not. And that is what Sri Lanka has undertaken, most of that, or has gone a long way towards that. I mean, the restructuring of public enterprises is going to take some more time. Now, the second half of your question was, what more can we do to get the best out of it? I think it is these structural reforms that are needed to get growth going again. So there's a huge agenda, for instance, on trade policy. You know, Sri Lanka, which was one of the first countries to liberalize trade back in the 1970s, has gone more protectionist over the last 10 to 15 years. And the trade ratios, the ratio of trade to GDP has been coming down. That's not sustainable. That's another Ponzi scheme that we can't sustain. So I think you have to open up trade, and then there are possibilities of liberalizing various other aspects of the economy, such that the entrepreneurial capacity of Sri Lankans can be actually harnessed to be able to flourish in the global marketplace. This country has demonstrated that they can do it. We've done it. You know, the growth rate doubled when they liberalized trade back in the 1970s. So it can be done, but we have to do it.
Anything you want to add?
So I think I agree with Shanta that, this is not about IMF conditions. It's about executing the best possible plan for Sri Lanka's recovery. And I believe that plan must come from the government, not the IMF. But as I said earlier, we have a technical problem. The government wasn't able to figure out why it was failing and drove the country into, very critical failure. So what you're having is a situation where within government, and maybe KDU graduates will solve this in the future, we haven't had the technical capacity to come up with a good plan. And we've executed plans that failed for the country. But even today, it's not the IMF's job to give us the plan. When you want to get funding for your business, you don't ask the credit officer of the bank to write your business plan and then complain that he wrote a business plan that's not good for your business. You write your own business plan and convince the credit officer that it's the best plan for your business, and he, of course, must accept the best plan for your business. Otherwise, the bank won't get paid. So if there are conditions, and it's not conditions, so and the technical document you sign is called the letter of intent. IMF doesn't give a letter saying here are the conditions. We give a letter saying this is what we like to do, this is our plan, just like going to the bank and giving a business plan. And IMF says, look, we agree that this is a good plan, just like the bank evaluates your business plan, and if you fudge the numbers, if you lied about it, if you're keeping two accounts, they call you out and say, no, we don't believe you're telling us the truth. So IMF's role is to be that kind of evaluator, not to write the plan. We must write the plan. Anytime you hear a politician or senior decision maker telling you they did something because the IMF said so, you should say, why are you doing that? You should do it because it's the best for the country. Nothing else should be done. The IMF has no reason and no justification for asking Sri Lanka to do anything that is not the best plan for Sri Lanka. And when we do it, we must own it and say this is our plan, and we are doing it because it is the best for Sri Lanka. Right? So I think we must be very clear about that. But I think maybe because of lack of capacity, we somehow don't take ownership of our own future and our own plan, and that may be why. And of course, you need the IMF to say that this, and you need a commitment device afterwards. That's why it becomes conditions. As I said in the earlier saying, for 20 years we have failed to meet our revenue targets on the budget. in those 20 years, we've been 10 years inside IMF programs, and 10 of those, 12 years inside IMF programs, sorry. 10 of those 12 years, we failed to meet even the targets we agreed with IMF. So Sri Lanka has a behavioral problem. The government doesn't do what it says. It doesn't say what it does. You file RTIs and ask, how is the budget money spent? You can't find out for 70% of the spending, you can't get information. So democracy is also at the heart of the problem. Just like technical capability, a government that is not accountable to the people on how it spends its money and why it makes the plans it does, will tend to abuse and misuse that money. And I think part of the problem, and we need to get to, is that without, and this is where the Arangale really kicked in. It realized that the problem, and Shanta will speak more about it, the problem was not that is that we trusted government too much, and people, it wasn't accountable to people. And government was abusing and misusing the money of people and getting people into crisis. And now we need an external anchor of credibility or somebody who looks from outside and audits us, because the Sri Lankan people have lost the ability to make the government keep its commitments. We vote a government in, it does what it likes, it puts things in budgets, never acts according to them or acts mostly in breach of them. And therefore, it's terrible to need an external anchor, because you can have internal anchors of credibility. That's what democracy is. But because our democracy is failing, you now need an external anchor of commitment. But in the Arangale, Shanta always says he saw hope, because people were finally waking up and saying, we need to keep the government accountable to us.
I will come to that. Before we get to accountability and transparency, so what's next? You alluded to saying that we are very close to getting into the IMF program. So what is next? What is our way forward from here?
Okay, so let's say we get the IMF program approved by the end of this month. That's how close I think we are. That first of all means that there's some foreign exchange that comes into the economy. The entire program is $2.9 billion, but it'll be in at least four installments. So it'll be a quarter of that coming through the first instance. The important thing is that also opens the way for funding budget support from the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And the numbers they're talking about is about $5 billion between the two of them. So that will open up some space for foreign exchange for the country. But the most important thing is what Vishal was talking about, which is it gives that credibility. It provides the seal of approval that the IMF has scrutinized the program and decided that this is worth investing. And if the IMF can invest in it, the World Bank can invest in it, the ADB can invest in it, maybe some private entrepreneurs can invest in it too. The second part of that is the debt restructure, because with that IMF program, part of that IMF program is this agreement among the creditors, the official creditors, to negotiate a debt restructure. So the day after the program, I'm sure, we will start the negotiations with the creditors, both the private bondholders as well as the official creditors. Now that might take a while to reach a conclusion, and usually with the IMF programs, the requirement is that you reach the debt restructuring by the time of the first review of the program, which can take place in about 6 to 12 months from approval. And then I think, this increase in credibility, as well as the additional foreign exchange, will actually allow the economy to start growing again. Because, all these import controls that have been put in because of the lack of foreign exchange is really undermining the performance of the Sri Lankan economy. And we've seen that. Growth was negative 9% last year. In fact, Sri Lanka is the second lowest growth rate next to Ukraine. So you can imagine the league we're in. And, but now that the foreign exchange constraint has been relaxed a bit, we can relax some of the import constraints. And then the exporters can actually import goods so that they can start exporting again. And that can then lead to a virtuous cycle where exports bring in foreign exchange, we then enable you to buy more imports, and we can actually come out of it. So I think this can be a critical step in that revival of the Sri Lankan economy.
Is there anything that we can do to expedite the process in terms of getting our economy back on track, or are there things that can slow us down?
You know, so the way to go fast rather than slow, and we are on the slow train, is to be able to do technical analysis and make commitments quickly ourselves. In an event tomorrow, Shamini Kure, who's also a co-advisor with Shanta to the government, will tell you, if you join it, that in Korea in 1998, when they were restructuring their debt, from the day they suspended debt payment to finishing and completing a restructure, it took less than 3 months. You know, they agreed in 1.5 months, they had an IMF program, in 3 months they were done with the debt restructure. Now, that's hard to match, and other reasons why it was possible to do it so soon. But even in 2020, Argentina, Ecuador got this done in 5 months, under 6 months. So, you know, it is partially the capacity of your own country to move quickly, to come up with its own plan, come up with its own analysis, and push forward with it. You have to be proactive. If you're very reactive, you tell the IMF, well, why don't you tell us what the best plan is? Why don't you give us an analysis? Then you sit and think about it. You go back. This is on the slow train. You need to take, the fast train is you proactively jump in and you say, look, I made a mistake, I got it wrong. Here are my solutions, and these solutions are pretty good. Others accept it, you move fast. That's when you get, so Sri Lanka is on an 18-month path, rather than what I would have said is, 3 months I think is actually difficult anyway, and Korea was exceptional. But we could have been on a 6 to 9 month path. But we are really on an 18-month path to debt restructuring, and even on that slow train, we are very slow. Right? It's stopping in too many stations and stopping for too long. And the best thing we can do is get the act together and be proactive.
That's something.
Some of these reforms, it's no secret that some of these reforms are politically very difficult. Think about I'm suggesting something that the students can help with in accelerating. And the fact is that these reforms are politically very difficult. We saw the heartache over the increase in electricity prices, or the reducing gasoline subsidies, or tax increases. But, if you look at the analysis, let's take the case of fuel subsidies, for instance. You look at gasoline subsidies, petrol subsidies in Sri Lanka, 60% of those subsidies go to the richest 20% of the population. Now think about that. So you're giving a check, you're giving money to the richest 20%, and that's the majority of the money you're spending on fuel subsidies. If you had given it out equally to every Sri Lankan, they'd only get 20%. So they're getting 3 times as much as they would get just as being citizens, let alone if you were targeted to the poor. You could have given the poor much more. But this kind of analysis is not sufficiently appreciated around the country, and part of it, frankly, is because, as Nishan said, some of it is done from outsiders. But if students and intellectuals and economists and political scientists in the country can do the analysis and just put it out there. It's not like you're taking a stand on the issue or you're supporting the JVP or the SJB or whatever. You're just saying these are the facts. You should know the facts when you vote, or you should know the facts before you start protesting something that is really a benefit to the rich. And I think there's a huge potential for that. There are a lot of other reforms, I can tell you, that are coming down the pike, or that should be coming down the pike, that we can help build the political support for if we do the analysis.
So I think we lost you, Mr. Suresh, for a few minutes, and I'm glad you're back. We were talking about structural change, reforms that we need. If you can add something on that, about the structural change that we need to go through.
Yeah, thank you, Tamara. So I hope since I got lost, I didn't hear parts of it. I hope I'm not repeating anything. I want to start from where Nishan left off on the question that you asked him about accelerating the program. Is it going to take time? Can we shorten it? Actually, Nishan is right. I mean, we are on a slow train. But for me, the bigger concern actually is whether we can make this sustainable. These reforms that we are doing, whether we can make these reforms sustainable. And the reason that I raised this question is the fact that, since independence 75 years ago, we've been to the IMF 16 times, this is the 17th time. What makes us think that if we go along the same way that we've been going over the past 75 years, what makes us believe that, we won't be back in an IMF program for the 18th time by 2028? And to me, that is the most fundamental question. And just to remind everyone, it was Albert Einstein, I think, who once said something to the effect that doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of insanity. But Sri Lanka has been doing this 17 times the IMF, and we are still going back to it. So to me, the problem, whilst yes, we are in an economic crisis, the challenge that we have is much deeper than economics. And to me, it's a problem of governance. And I would like to define governance in three ways here. So three things. One is incompetence, one is irresponsibility, and third is corruption. Unless we address these three issues, and we address it through legislative means, through legal and regulatory means, we can't make the economic reforms that Shanta and Nishan are talking about. We simply can't make them sustainable, we can't make them stick, and we will be back with the IMF for our 18 program very soon. So how do we address these three issues from a legislative or regulatory basis? There are some very simple things that can be done, and can be done reasonably fast as well. I will just give you three examples. There are more, but I'll give you three. Firstly, when we go to vote for the different candidates, the only thing that we know about these candidates is their name. Now, no way will we just go by the name when we are interviewing some person for a job in any one of our companies. I mean, I'm not talking at a senior level, I'm even talking at the level of a PM. You would want to know a lot more than a person's name. But here we send people to parliament, we just simply know their name. So why can't we mandate that the political parties, for instance, publish not just the name of a candidate, but for example, their education qualifications, their professional experience, and their age, so that voters have, and maybe some other information as well, but mandate this, so that voters have a better idea of the people whom we are sending to parliament. So we start to address, at least to some level, the issue of competence. Now, I think when you look at the numbers, in parliament we have something like 94 out of our 225 representatives who haven't even passed the A-level. And these are the people whom we rely on to guide the country's economy, to set the laws of the country, basically to govern the country, and 94 of them haven't even passed their A-level. So we need to change this, and we need to do this through the regulatory process. So one idea is to mandate a certain amount of information that the political parties will put out, and that same information, maybe 1 week before an election, let the election commissioner also put out that same information, right? So that this is one suggestion. A second suggestion, and this is to break the the control that the politicians have over the administrative service. And this really is a result of Article 52(2) of our Constitution, which says that a public servant or a ministry secretary needs to work under the direction and control. Those are the two words used, the direction and control of the minister. So which means that the public servant needs to take whatever orders that the minister gives. Now, if you look at the role of the minister and of the public servant, the minister's role is to set policy, and the public servant's role is to run the ministry according to the ARs and the FRs. But because our constitution says that a ministry secretary needs to work under the direction and control of the minister, even if the minister were to give an order which contravenes the ARs and the FRs, still the secretary has to follow those orders. So again, we need to change that piece of legislation, allowing the minister to dictate policy, but giving the freedom to the ministry secretary to run the administration of the ministry, to give the civil service more independence. So that's a second change. And the third change is on asset declaration. I think we need to make it compulsory. Not just make asset declaration compulsory, but make income tax declarations also compulsory, and have a process where we reconcile the two, so that, in the event there are discrepancies, these can be reconciled and the right questions answered. So that like this, there are 7 or 8 things that we can do really quickly to work on these 3 issues of incompetence, of irresponsibility, and of corruption. And to stop, or not to stop, but at least to minimize. I don't think you can completely eliminate, but we can minimize. And by minimizing, if we address the governance issues, then we start to make these economic reforms that we are speaking of, we will start to make them stick. If we don't improve the governance side, the economic reforms that we are talking about to address the current crisis, they simply will not stick, as we've seen in the past. We've gone to the IMF 16 times before, the 17th time. We've simply got to tell ourselves we will never go back to the IMF. Not because the IMF is bad or not because their programs are not sound, but simply because as a country, we need to manage our economy and our country the way we need to manage it well. And I think we have the skills and the talent within the country to do that. And so we simply got to tell ourselves, we've got to take responsibility for our own selves.
Okay, so looks like Sri Lanka is a bad learner, at least with regards to going to the IMF. Or is it that there is a much bigger endemic problem in the country that we keep on going to the IMF, we are not addressing the real problem? I think that is what you were alluding to in terms of the governance. Maybe you want to take to that?
No, the problem is here, not at the IMF. Right? Let's be very clear. And the problem is, and this, it became so clear from the Amagalaya movement that the problem is accountability. And I would compliment what Suresh said. And accountability is not just elections. Elections is just one small part. But frankly, I think Sri Lankans have, since independence, thought, well, we have an election every 4 or 5 years, so we don't have to be accountable during the intervening 4 years between elections. That's where the problem is. And I would say that more than the competence of the civil servants, it's the accountability of civil servants to the people. That's what really amazes me. I've worked all over Africa, and it's quite common when you think of a major legislation, like, say, education reform in a country, you take it out to the public and you interact with village women or civil society and various groups just to get their feedback. And when they were doing education reform in Sri Lanka, it was a group of technocrats sitting around in a room, maybe you two, who sort of said, well, we know what's best for this country, so let's just go ahead and do it. Let me just say, Saman Kelagama, the late Saman Kelagama, wrote this fascinating book called Economic Policy in Sri Lanka, where he got all the architects of the major economic policy episodes, Lal Jayawardena, Gandhi, Korea, all of these guys, miraculously got them all before they died to write a chapter about their experience. And it's a marvelous piece, a real classic. But what was fascinating to me is they all describe, like the ones who did the trade liberalization, they all describe how they consulted with the IMF, they consulted with the World Bank, they consulted with the UN. Not one of them ever mentions that they consulted with the people. There's no mention in that book about any kind of consultation with the general people, even though these decisions profoundly affected those people's lives. That's the problem we're facing.
I think I want to fully endorse the governance problem, but I want to modify maybe what Shanta said about the IMF. Sri Lanka the main problem is with Sri Lanka. Not that there aren't problems with the IMF. There are also problems with the IMF, and there are problems in every global structure we live in. There are problems with the UN, there are problems with the World Bank, and since I'm working from inside Sri Lanka, I'm often frustrated with IMF. Why do you have prior conditions that you're hiding? Why not be transparent about it? Shanta is from the World Bank. They don't hide their conditions. And they don't wait for board level approval to make them transparent and public. They will put it out in a green paper or a yellow paper and say, this is what we are negotiating with the country. But honestly, why are we, what Shanta is saying is we shouldn't be blaming the IMF because the government should be public. Because we already have a government that can make that information public. Why is it hiding that information? Nobody is forcing that information to be hidden. The fact that the IMF's transparency policy is not good enough is one thing, but my government's transparency policy is not good enough. And the government is accountable to me more than the IMF. And that's what Shanta means. We must ask first questions of the government. So, the whole problem is that it goes back to government doesn't want to be accountable to the people. And democracy in that sense has failed in Sri Lanka. Because democracy is government by the people, for the people. And if you have a government that you keep electing people into parliament, they don't want to be accountable. They don't want to reveal information, even RTI information is not revealed. And this is, very, very leading institutions in government ministries that are hiding what they're doing, because if they were doing the right thing, they don't need to hide. But there can also be a cultural problem. As Shanta says, historically there was that top-down approach, command and control. That all these great economists, and so many friends of mine in that list, and ones I've worked with since the 1990s, and I realized they had a feudal mentality. They thought, all you need is, we know best, we can tell the rest. We command and control, and they didn't mean it badly. They just thought that's the right way to do it, because after all, we are the smart guys, we are the big guys. But what democracy teaches us, and the success of democracies and the failure of non-democracies all over the world teaches us, is there is such enormously valuable information that comes up from the bottom. And that process of listening, so democracy is really government by discussion. The process of discussing, the process of listening, the process of having the sentiments of people and the majority of people who are impacted by policies, to have a say in your policies, really improves constructively what you're going to do. Its information, its ability to improve, its understanding. So democracy is not just a nice thing about letting people have a vote or have a say. It is a technocratically important thing because it is what provides us the feedback and the information and the understanding and the consensus to be able to succeed with the policies we go forward. But unfortunately, coming out of our colonial past, we've inhabited colonial mentalities in the way we do policy and the way we run our institutions. And it is top down. If we don't change it, we won't achieve what Suresh said. We won't get rid of corruption. corruption. We want to get accountability, and we want to get competence.
So on that same thought,
Tamara,
yes, go ahead.
can I just add, the point that Nishan makes about democracy, I think that again is a very fundamental thing that we need to look at. Our name of our country, it says democratic. Our political parties say that they run our country democratically. But you ask the question, how many of these political parties who say they represent us and run our country democratically, how many of them in their constitutions do they have democratic features? In the constitutions of our political parties. Now, I think this again is something that we need to mandate. The Election Commission should not allow a political party whose constitution is not democratic to run for democratic elections. This is again a fundamental. So these are some of the changes that we need to bring in if Sri Lanka is to move forward, if Sri Lanka is to change.
Okay, so on that same thought, I wanted to ask, we are waiting for, with regards to listening to the people. On the other hand, what I have observed is that we are waiting for a third party, external third party, thousands of miles away to issue us warnings or downgrade our Fitch rating to tell us we are in trouble. Think of a tsunami, which takes like 3 or 4 hours. We already have a warning system in place, so we can run for safety. But in terms of economic crisis, it's in the months. It takes months or maybe years in the making. And why do we wait for some external third party to tell us we are in trouble? Why don't we act before? We should know things before they get to know that we are in trouble, right?
I would say that we have all the early warning systems we need, we just don't observe them or pay attention to them. And here, just say something a little controversial. I think this is the real value of borrowing in private capital markets, in international capital markets, the bonds. Because what international sovereign bonds do is they give you real-time information of how well you are managing your economy, because it gets reflected in the prices of those bonds in the secondary market, or the interest rates go up. And this has been an experience around the world. I remember being in Indonesia when, and this was in the 1980s, or early 90s, before the internet and everything else, when they started issuing sovereign bonds, and they brought in a TV set into the cabinet room, so they could watch how the bond prices were fluctuating while they were making their cabinet decisions about public expenditures and so on. It was a way of getting real-time information to discipline government into making prudent fiscal choices. So this information is out there. And Sri Lanka does borrow in international capital markets, and we saw this, the bonds were selling at what, 30 cents to the dollar or 20 cents to the dollar? That's a bad sign. That was back in 2019 or 2020. But we have to listen to it. And frankly, I think one of the problems is there's also this possibility of borrowing from official creditors, like China or India or Japan. And those don't convey the kind of information that you need as an early warning system, because they're lending for geopolitical reasons and other reasons. So I would say you should rely more on private capital markets, in addition for the loans, but in addition to the fact that they contain enormously valuable information that give you real-time signals, or early warning signals, before there's a problem.
So there's another court case now in the Supreme Court that's asking a question. Why didn't we know? Why didn't we understand? And the reason we don't know why is because of this information hiding problem. And the court demanded that the central bank submit to court all the advice that it gave the monetary board and that it gave the minister of finance. So that's just out, and I would say your students here in KDU go look up that information and analyze it. It's in the public domain, it's in the courts. When it's something submitted to court, it's in the public domain. And try to understand, and this is a great research project, who got it wrong? Was the right advice given and did the monetary board not act on it? Or did the minister get the right advice and fail to act on it? Or were the bureaucrats and technocrats themselves giving advice that was in the wrong direction? Sri Lanka needs to know that, because if you don't diagnose where your problem is, then the prescription and the medicine can be wrong. Suresh said, let's get more educated ministers. But great, but you can have educated people also do terrible, unaccountable things. So, and Suresh knows that's not enough, but we need to figure out where it went wrong. Did we have a technocracy that failed us? Did we have a monetary mode that was too politicized? Or did we have ministers and decision makers who were testing, and then we try to fix that? But the diagnosis process is an accountability process. We've got to go in and find out how it happened, because as Suresh said, if you don't understand why you failed IMF programs 7 out of the last 16 times, then how do you know you're going to fix it? Right? So what Suresh is saying is, look, let's understand why we are failing, because this is not simply about another patchwork, another band-aid, another first aid to tide over the next 4 or 5 years. The Japanese do this wonderful thing, they ask why 5 times. It's called root cause analysis. I just published a paper in the Japanese Economist on this issue, because the Japanese are very keen to understand Sri Lanka. And they don't just stop at the first why. Why did this happen? Or we didn't have enough dollars. Why was that? Or we couldn't borrow. But they keep going. Why did that happen? Why did that happen? Until you get to the root cause. I would say that even the IMF program today in Sri Lanka does not have an adequate diagnosis. We don't have a root cause analysis. And if we learn anything from the competence and the remarkable success of the Japanese, and what Suresh is saying, we are missing a root cause analysis, and the solution we are embarking on then is likely to be suboptimal, it's likely to fail, and we'll be back in the situation. So, enormously important work for students and researchers to do, getting to the root cause analysis. Why did we fail? And come up with recommendations and proposals that fix that problem. Without simply fixing the symptoms, as we might be doing.
So we are almost running out of time, but I want to ask this question because we have Mr. Suresh Shah here, and I think everybody wants to know what is the plan for state-owned enterprises. Since you are directly working with that restructuring plan, there is no better person to ask and get answers. So we would like to, if you can tell us about the plan. And what, maybe if you can reveal which enterprises are planning to privatize, which will stay, and how did you decide?
So, Tamara, everyone focuses on this whole privatization story when we start talking about state-owned enterprise restructuring or state-owned enterprise reform. But I think we need to set some fundamental frameworks. So let me try to articulate some of those frameworks. So first and foremost, we've got to ask ourselves, what kind of enterprise should government be in control of? And I think there is a fairly clear framework for this. So firstly, if there are some national security concerns around some particular enterprise, then it makes sense for government maybe to have some control over that. Secondly, if the private sector is not willing in sufficient numbers to cater to the public an essential good product or service, then I think there is a case for government to be involved in making sure that the public gets that essential product or service. So that's the second one. And thirdly, if government, if a country has some very valuable resource, like say minerals or oil or something like this, there is then possibly a case where government needs to be involved in one way or the other in managing that resource and in exploiting that resource. Now, if you leave these three out, I don't think there is any other rationale for government to be involved in a business. So rather than simply saying, let's go take some enterprises and privatize them, I think we got to say, here is the framework. If an enterprise does not fit this framework, let's put it in private hands, because the private sector can manage capital, can manage distribution, can manage sales, etc. much better than the government can. So this is number one. Number two, when you ask yourself what are the fundamental responsibilities of government, and they could be things like law and order, national security, economic policy, foreign policy, and so on and so forth. Again, this running of commercial enterprises doesn't really fit into the primary responsibilities of government. So that's the second thing that we need to be aware of. The third question that crops up all the time is, why do you want to privatize profitable enterprises? Now, so here we need to look at enterprises in the private sector and enterprises within government sector, and we need to understand that there is only one financial difference between these two, and that is the dividends that the government would earn from a government-controlled enterprise. Other than that, if you look at a private enterprise, every single private enterprise in the country would pay 15% of their top line as VAT and would pay 30% of its bottom line as income tax. So without government being involved in any work, it earns 15% of a company's top line and it earns 30% of a company's bottom line for free. It doesn't need to do anything at all. I mean, let the private sector runs and it makes its contribution to government. The only difference in a SOE is that it might pay a dividend. Now, if you take the dividends and analyze it, A as a percentage of GDP or B as a percentage of the total revenue of the SOEs, the amount that the dividends contributes towards the country's economy is extremely small. And frankly, if you have private businesses, private capital running these enterprises, just the increase in the revenue and the VAT that you would get through the increase in that revenue would more than compensate for the dividends that the government currently earns from these SOEs. So when so rather than simply say, we need funds coming into the system, we need to build our reserves, let's take something and sell it. Instead of doing that, I think we need to understand what the framework should be. Why government needs to be in certain businesses and why government really should not be in many other businesses. So I'm just trying to give you a flavor. Unfortunately, I can't go into details due to confidentiality and say, this particular enterprise or that particular enterprise. But this is a kind of an overall flavor when you try to identify what businesses should be and should not be within the scope of government. So that's one. But when you talk about SOE reforms, there are lots of other things that need to be done. So for example, we need to build the right governance systems into these SOEs, but might remain within government. So proper appointment of boards, the information that these companies need to give out to the public. So let me take this as an example. If you're a listed company, a private sector enterprise which is listed on the Colombo Stock Exchange, and let's assume they have 1,000 shareholders, these companies are mandated by law. They've got to publish their accounts every quarter. Now, SOE has 22 million shareholders, right? Every one of us are shareholders in these SOEs, but they are not mandated to publish their accounts. Why? So if a company with 1,000 shareholders or with 500 shareholders has to publish its accounts quarterly, I think it's only right that a company, that an enterprise with 22 million shareholders does exactly the same thing. So similarly, we need to bring other governance rules and regulations, mandatory requirements into these SOEs to make sure that they are better managed, that they are professionally managed. Another important aspect that we've got to look at in SOE reforms is to split regulatory bodies running commercial businesses. Now there are instances where the role of a regulator is to regulate enterprises, regulate the market. But when a regulator gets into running a business in the market in which he regulates, there's a huge conflict of interest. And in Sri Lanka, we have examples of those. So one example might be the Ports Authority. They regulate the port activities, but they are also running jetties and they're running ports as well. So there is a conflict of interest, so we need to address these issues. So I'm just giving you a broad flavor of some of the reforms that need to be put into the SOE sector. So it's not just privatizing, but even in terms of what businesses, government needs to own, we need to set this framework up. We need to set the benchmarks and move forward accordingly. So unfortunately, I can't give you specific enterprises with confidentiality, but here this is an overall flavor of some of the things that we'll be doing.
Okay, 1 minute.
Tamara, a very important thing that Suresh is saying that I think comes as a challenge to academics and universities is that this is not an ideological problem. Is it good to privatize, bad to privatize? It's an analytical problem. And it's not how you privatize or not, right? That really answers the question. So you can do the discounted cash flows of privatization versus government ownership, you can do valuations, and privatizations can go hugely wrong. Lanka Marine Services Limited was a government-owned, highly profitable state monopoly, and the government said, we'd like to bring competition, so we're going to privatize. They undervalued the entity and sold it at an undervalued price. They gave free land. Then they gave it a tax holiday, so now the government didn't earn everything, so they said it was going to earn. And then they gave it monopoly status as well. And this is all in a Supreme Court judgment that said, please reverse this privatization. So it's not whether you privatize, it's how you privatize. And if there aren't people doing the analysis, then government can become unaccountable and you can get it wrong. If universities don't produce the academics, the students who are diving deep in as an analytical question, not ideological question, and showing at what price is this actually better for the public, at what price or what terms is it not so good for the public, willing to analyze contracts, then we may not get the outcome we want. So I want to encourage all of you, you are obviously intellectually capable people, and you can get into being part of the solution. That means you must do the analysis on the data and information available that guides decision making in a way that serves the public interest rather than perhaps privatized interests.
All right, thank you. So let's open up for questions. I will take about 2 or 3 questions from the floor and please keep your questions short so that we can give more time for the panelists to answer the questions. Please raise your hand if you have a question and someone with the mic can get to you. Yes.
Thank you. Comment rather than a question, but it can lead to a question. So those additionalities that or whatever you may call it, of IMF, I think I'm concerned as a person who is representing the civil society as well as the professional sector of this country, particularly the sector which cares for the people in terms of providing healthcare. Now, one of the requirements was to address corruption, right? Then second was to have a social safety net or revisit the social protection system of Sri Lanka. Now, I have not seen the kind of emphasis or the importance given to those 2 areas in the entire process. I think I met you 1 year ago and we discussed about this. And the rationale was that you save a lot of money that you use to subsidize these sectors. Once the prices are fixed, that money will come to to alleviate the pain. Everyone talks about pain, and even the IMF director day before yesterday, referred to the people of Sri Lanka has to go through some pain. But the problem is the pain is not equitable. The pain is more felt by the most vulnerable and the low-income groups of this country. And the corruption, it's blatant. I know for a fact that the health sector procurement of drugs, how the Indian credit line was used. So unless we address and have mechanisms in place to address corruption, which I don't see, so how IMF can say that the government of Sri Lanka has fulfilled these conditions? Then on the social protection, I think the competence is there. This country has competent people. I'm sure even in the financial sector. It's just that they are not in the decision-making process. They are not in the right places. So I think IMF or whoever now, we need to question as citizens, and we are doing that. We are even going to courts on these issues, right? But I think IMF should also seriously look at those as well. And finally, we have to pay back these loans. So some of the decisions that have been taken, the reforms are really affecting even the producers, the SMEs, they are collapsing. So how do we generate an income as a nation to repay the loans? Because in the process we are destroying a certain segment of the business community as well as micro enterprises, and people are becoming destitute. So I'm really puzzled and really concerned as a professional and a citizen where we are heading, because it can lead to serious social upheaval. Thank you.
Any other questions? Maybe we'll take another. There are any other questions on the floor? Okay, go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much for an important and a very enlightening discussion today. I have a small question. This is regarding what Dr. Nishan mentioned before about the 18-month restructuring period. So I was wondering what kind of realistic proactive measures that can we take during this process, because I'm pretty sure all of us know that the corrupting nature of the governance always drives the advices and the policies that intellectuals and academics that you propose. So I was wondering what kind of proactive measures can we take?
Okay. 18-month period to search. So, I don't see any other questions. Maybe we'll address them, those questions now, and then go.
I'll take Vinya's multiple questions, shall we say. No, spot on. You're absolutely right, Vinya. The problem of corruption and social protection are huge in this. Let me start with social protection, because Sri Lanka is supposed to be this great social welfare state and everything else. And I took a look at Samurdi, the premier social transfer program in the country. The leakage rate is unbelievable. Right? What is it, 60%? 58% of those who receive Samruddhi are not poor, and about 60% of the people of the poor don't receive Samruddhi. Right? This is outrageous. Now, you can't, coming back to why doesn't the IMF do something about this? The first question to ask, as Nishan was saying earlier, is when is the government going to do something about this? And I'll get to the corruption point here. Because what we have also observed, mostly by anecdotal evidence, but some systematic evidence, is that Samruddhi is used as a form of political patronage. The Niyamakas have been told, don't give these transfers to the households that voted for us in the last election, and don't give them to the households that voted for the opposition.
Maybe somebody needs to mute. Yeah.
So this is the deep politics of it. Now, the IMF and the World Bank can do things, and we are doing things, to try to help strengthen or plug the leakages in the system by introducing electronic transfer, for instance, so that it's not the demarkers who are handing out the transfers. We improved the identification, and we have a Verite research paper by Delaney Gunawan showing how if you use the electricity bill as a form of criteria for eligibility, you can do better than some of these current means testing programs. The same thing is true about corruption as a whole, because corruption is a problem of the government. This is, and it's a huge problem. Now, so the IMF can only do so much because it can't tell, it doesn't help to just tell the government, don't be corrupt. No, we've tried that, right? That hasn't worked. Right? So what they are doing, and I'll be very specific about that, there are two things in the IMF program. One is to bring Sri Lanka's anti-corruption policy to the level of the UN agreed upon policies. So that's a condition that they have to meet. Those are the limits to which the IMF can go. But the second part, and actually I had a conversation with Joel Churchward, I didn't tell you about that. The second part is the IMF is doing an anti-corruption diagnostic of Sri Lanka. And they're going to take up some of the issues that you raised. Procurement policy, for instance, which affects the drugs and in the health sector, and a range of others, including the judiciary. So I think they're at least ready to look at those things, to maximize the impact, because frankly, there's a problem here because the IMF works with the government. So first, I suspect that the report, even if it discovers some really egregious things, will be more politely expressed in the report to the government. And also, it gives government a chance to ignore it and not do anything about it. Because these are sensitive issues. So that's where you come in, Vinya. Because what I have proposed, I don't know whether they take it, what I proposed is that civil society prepare their own governance report in parallel with the IMF. And both are submitted to the government. So first of all, you can see whether there's a difference between the IMF's view and civil society's view. But secondly, I think it's harder for government to ignore a civil society report that is produced alongside the IMF report.
Dr. Nishan, you can address the proactive measures.
I had a chat with George Turkovitz, and I forgot to tell you about that. And in fact, Vinya and I are part of a program to do exactly what you said. Because we understand that asking the IMF to fix corruption in our country is inefficient. I mean, we may need their help to endorse it because Sri Lanka suffers from a lack of democracy and government doesn't listen. But so I think we are in a part of a civil society coalition that India has supported hugely to take that forward, exactly in that way. Coming to proactive measures, what can Sri Lanka do? First, let's implement credible budgets. I said 20-year track record of failure on revenue. This year, there are people in this room who work with me, who are from KDU in the past, who've helped analyze the budget and have said, look, we are going to fail our revenue targets by more than 10%. The moment that becomes visible, and it will become visible in 4 to 6 months' time, and maybe then we are going to go on for long. We're certainly not credible. When the president says he has no money for elections because he's not sure the revenue is going to come in, but he just passed a budget 1 month ago before saying that this is the revenue we target. So if you don't put in the policies and you don't present credible budgets, then how are you going to go fast? I mean, that's the real problem. So lack of credibility, integrity in budgets, and that the people can believe what the government is saying and doing, this is a critical aspect to fix, and that's why it takes so long. Everybody wants to wait and see whether these guys are actually doing what they're saying. and whether what they're saying is what they're doing, right? So this is really, I think, Sri Lanka's problem, that if you are governed that way and we don't trust government, how do you expect others to trust government? And if they don't trust government, how do you expect credibility? How do you expect that restructuring? How do you expect international multilateral support? So we really should not need external anchors, but it is how desperately incapable we are that we are in the situation. And I think there is also something wrong with our culture. We say Rajya Sevaya Pirisa, connotes the idea that we are serving a king or it's like the queen in her majesty's service. There is no majesty. These are public servants, as is the president, as is the MPs. They must serve the people. So I think in this culture where we have made we call them rulers, and we have put them in positions of authority where we are scared to question them, then we allow them to do things that are not in the interest of the country, and we don't know how to fix it. We ask the world to come and fix it for us. So we have to put authority must be accountable, must be answerable to the people that they govern. That's the sense of it. And we must build a culture in which authority can be questioned, can be challenged. In verite, we have an environment where 21-year-olds come and tell me I'm wrong. And I really value that, because I do get it wrong. And if somebody didn't come and tell me or make me look at these numbers again, then I will probably do something that is also suboptimal. Right? So I think when you have a governance and corruption crisis of this magnitude, you also have a cultural problem in there. The culture has to shift in some way. When you look at how other countries evolved into democracies and into good governance and into economic prosperity, you see not just structural changes, but those structural changes come out of cultural changes. And people waking up and saying, we must take control of our own destinies, of our own decisions, and government must be accountable to us. So Sri Lanka needs not only that governance, or this governance structural shift is still not done. But if we can't get a cultural change that supports us, then this won't stick.
Right. So there are some
Tamara,
questions. Yes.
Tamara, can I just add to what, just also give an answer to Vinya, and also add to what Nishan just said.
Yes.
On the corruption side, on the corruption side, I think it's very, very important to digitize government to prevent the interaction between the citizen and the bureaucracy, because it's at the point of interaction that corruption happens. So if you can minimize a bit in terms of corruption, that's number one. Number two, Nishan's point about credible budgets. Again, and when I spoke first, I said some of these things need to be legislated, and we need to bring regulation around it. So take the fiscal management responsibility at the FMRA. I think we need to give it more teeth, and we need to strengthen it to achieve what Nishan is talking about, that we present more credible budgets. So the problem, the challenge with the FMRA in the last few years has been that the goalposts have been shifted on a regular basis. Now, in the event these goalposts need to be shifted, why can't we say it needs to come with a supermajority of parliament rather than just a simple majority? Which means then government needs to work with opposition most of the time to get these things done. It makes people more responsible. That's number one. Number two, in the event, in practice, in operations, if the goalposts do get shifted, let the finance minister go back to parliament and get ratification again with a supermajority. And if he or she doesn't get the supermajority, let the person resign. You then make sure that no finance minister will ever miss the target. So the point I'm making is, with our past experience, we simply can't rely on our politicians to do the right thing. We need to build some kind of legislation and regulation around it so that we just simply keep them on the straight and narrow. So those, just those two responses.
All right. So I will get a quick take a question from the from the chat. For those who are joining online, and maybe I will expect some really short, brief answers because of the interest of time. And this one is actually news to me. Maybe all of you are more aware about it. I'm just going to read it. Bloomberg reported a few minutes ago that China has given assurance to support budgetary restructuring. Is that right? Okay. It's news to me. The president is due to make a special announcement in Parliament. If this is in fact true, what would the next few weeks mean for us? And also going on to say, asking a question about the rupee appreciating these days. Is that temporary?
I'll give Shanta the hard question about the rupee and I'll take the IMF. Yeah, I always like to take the easy questions. What it means for us is very simple, that we are highly likely to get IMF board level approval in March, and all the other problems will remain exactly the same.
And the rupee appreciation, I think, is a short-term phenomenon, just over the last few weeks, because of the fact that there have been a few additional sources of foreign exchange. You might see some more appreciation if the IMF program goes through on the 20th of March because of the confidence level. But keep in mind that this country has a long history of overvalued exchange rates, which has also affected the trade patterns. So I'm not confident that the rupee will continue to appreciate. I mean, I was at a family dinner last night where they were speculating, oh, we'll go back to 200 rupees to the dollar or something like that. I don't think so. I think we'll have to be very vigilant on this because that's so important for promoting exports. This is the critical ingredient.
Maybe there is some positive news as we are about to end. We are so actually news to me that we are going to be getting it. So good. But there are a lot of questions, but in the interest of time, we can't take all the questions. So I will stop right now and thank you all for being here with us today. I know it is a busy time. I'm sure there are a lot of important things that you want to attend to. You are, Professor Shanti, you are here for a week, and you agreed to be here with us today morning. So we are actually honored and pleased to have all of you with us. And it has been insightful discussions, and we learned a lot. And I hope we will make those positive changes, and we can get out of this situation pretty soon. So with that, over to you, Dinesha.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tamara, and I request the panelists to be on stage, please. Too often in our circles, appreciation goes unspoken. So let us start anew with this very special token. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to show gratitude to our panelists. To do the honors, let me invite with respect our Vice Chancellor, Major General Mirinda Pires, accompanied by the Dean, Faculty of Management, Social Sciences and Humanities, Mr. Kitsiri Amaratunga. Now the panelists will be presented a token of appreciation. Firstly, Professor Shanta Devarajan. Next, Dr. Nishan Dimel. At this moment, we also acknowledge Mr. Suresh Shah joining us online. Now the panelists will position themselves for a photograph. And Vice Chancellor Sir, may we have you also.